So today we're going to talk about Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky, who's been getting an immense amount of attention during this war, and for very good reason. The famous line from Shakespeare is that some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And so what do we want to ask today is who is Volodymyr Zelensky and how did he get to be great in the context of this conflict? Someone who that most people around the world didn't know anything about 2 weeks ago is now one of the most famous people on the planet and is seen far and wide as a hero. How did this come to pass? Well, first, some background. Zelensky is 43 years old. He was born in Kryvyi Rih in central Ukraine. That's a city of about 680,000 people, known mostly for its iron industry. His father is a computer science professor. His father's father fought in the Red Army against the Nazis in World War II. And his father and three of his brothers were killed in the Holocaust as they, like Zelensky, were Jews. He is Jewish. And so that puts into context some of these things that Putin says about trying to get rid of Nazis in Kiev. He grew up in an apartment complex in Kryvyi Rih called Kvartal 95 or Quarter 95. That was the name of it. And that later became the name of the comedy troupe that he sort of founded and took part in with some of his closest friends, and then the name of the production company he formed. He and his buddies, when they were in their late teens, were participating in these basically comedy competitions, sort of a Ukrainian comedy equivalent of American Idol, where you compete against others and get voted up or down. And they ended up touring all over the former Soviet region, doing various kinds of sketch comedy and things like this. And almost all of it speaking Russian and basically in an entertainment business that was very much based in Russia and as I said, performing all through the former Soviet Union. After the war in Ukraine began in 2014, he advocated against barring Russian television shows in Ukraine because he was very much involved in that industry and was very severely criticized in Ukraine for that. But he also donated money to the Ukrainian army, which led to calls for him to be banned in Russia. And so you can see his background is one of not necessarily being a political ideologue, right? He was trying to get along with everybody. In 2015, he and his company started this TV show called Servant of the People. And if you can find it anywhere and get a chance to watch it, it used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it is now. But if you can get a chance to watch it, you should watch it. Because number one, it's very funny. And number two, it gives you, in sort of a satirical way, a sense of the things that Ukrainian people were frustrated about with their government. And in the TV show, he plays a history teacher, high school history teacher, who one day goes off on this rant about government corruption. And one of his students records the rant on their cell phone and posts the video nationwide. And his boss comes in his boss calls him in to criticize him, and he thinks he's going to lose his job. But what happens instead is he becomes a hero, this high school history teacher. So in the TV show, he plays a high school history teacher who sort of accidentally becomes president of Ukraine and then encounters all the craziness of government and corruption in Ukraine. And it's all, again, very, very funny. He rode then that role as a president on television into a campaign for president in 2019 in one of these bizarre sort of life imitating art kind of episodes. He was backed by the oligarch who ran one of the television channels that his programs appeared on, a guy named Ihor Kolomoisky, who himself is quite notorious, generally regarded as a criminal in many places, including, it appears, by the United States Justice Department. But Zelensky avoided typical campaign events, right? He was a young person, very comfortable with social media, and so he relied on Instagram. He avoided the standard TV talk shows. He basically argued that they were all part of the system, and he ran this then very creative campaign where he controlled the message because he was on Instagram rather than being quizzed by news broadcasters. So he ran against the incumbent president, a guy named Petro Poroshenko, Poroshenko ran as the establishment and as the nationalist, the guy who had stood up to Russia in the war that had started after 2014, the guy who had supported the independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Russian Church. And Poroshenko ran on this slogan, army, language, faith, and basically said that Zelensky was going to sell the country out to Russia, focusing on his connections to this oligarch who was seen to be not especially loyal, and on the fact that he did all this business in Russia. So Zelensky, in addition to campaigning on anti-corruption, which was the kind of thing that Poroshenko was pretty vulnerable to, he also promised that he would end the war with Russia without making substantial compromises, which is the kind of promise that people make when they're running for office that becomes very difficult to fulfill once you're in office. But he won. He won in a landslide with 75% of the vote, and in parliamentary elections that were held then later in 2019, a brand new party called Servant of the People, based on, the name came from Zelensky's TV show, and this new party was based around Zelensky, won a majority in the Ukrainian parliament. So all of a sudden, by late 2019, he was president, and he controlled a majority in the Ukrainian parliament. And there was a lot of hope, but I would also say a lot of fear, because there was this fear that he, either because he was a novice, was going to just get rolled by Putin, or because he seemed to be not so keen on standing up to Putin that he might negotiate a bad deal. So then, how did he go from being this comedian, running as a non-nationalist, promising to make a deal with Russia, and with many afraid that he was going to make a deal with Russia, how did this guy become a hero of Ukraine's resistance to Russia? Well, it happened in steps, and some of these steps, of course, were taken by Putin, not by Zelensky himself. First of all, I should say, though, despite his promises, Zelensky did much less to combat corruption than many had hoped. Why was this? Well, it seems that Zelensky, like many earlier would-be reformers in Ukraine, found out that many of his strongest supporters, such as Kolomoisky, but others as well, opposed important aspects of this reform agenda because those reforms would have impeded the kind of way that these people were doing business. And Kolomoisky had some particularly interesting involvements with a bankrupt Ukrainian bank that eventually got the U.S. government and the IMF involved. And at some point, Zelensky sort of had to choose between doing deals with the West and Kolomoisky, and chose the West, but he was ultimately seen as not being as effective against corruption as many had hoped, and so his popularity had started to drop. Most people, let's say by 2021, before any of this latest crisis blew up, his popularity was declining, although he was still the most popular politician in Ukraine. And I think many would have said that the glass of reform in Ukraine was half empty, or perhaps three-quarters empty. He did genuinely try to make a deal with Putin and with Russia. After his election in late 2019, he voiced his willingness to implement the Minsk II agreement according to something called the Steinmeier formula. The Steinmeier formula, named for the German foreign minister at the time who put the plan forward, was an attempt to break an impasse over the order in which the steps envisioned in the Minsk agreement would be implemented. Russia basically wanted to do it something like this, and I'm simplifying. First, Ukraine agrees to regional autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk. Then there would be elections in those regions for new governments, and then, and only then, would Ukraine regain control of the territory. Most Ukrainians, that seemed like a trap, right? Especially for elections to take place while Russia still controlled the region, right? The belief was Russia would control the elections, Russia would make sure that pro-Russian politicians got elected, and this would be the sort of fifth column in Ukraine that Putin wanted. So Ukrainians wanted basically the opposite order, and that was something the Russians wouldn't agree to. So when Zelensky agreed to a compromise on this, it was seen by many people in Ukraine as being too big a concession, and there were protests against it on the streets of Kiev. Some of these protests were actually violent. But I think what was equally important for Zelensky was that he got basically no response from Russia. Putin seems to have basically said, we're going to pocket that compromise and wait for more. And Zelensky appears to have concluded that that while he thought he could do a deal with Putin, that he was beginning to learn maybe that Putin wasn't so interested in a deal as much as Putin just wanted Ukraine to capitulate. And so it seemed that Putin was less interested in peace than Zelensky had thought. And so while Zelensky did not escalate the war, his rhetoric hardened, and he really didn't make too many more attempts to make dramatic concessions or peace overtures. He did manage to broker with the Russians a prisoner swap that allowed a whole bunch of Russians that the Ukrainians had captured and Ukrainians that the Russians had captured to go home, and I think everybody on all sides saw that as a positive development. But as his term wore on, he seemed less conciliatory. And I think this peaked crucially early in 2021 when a guy called Viktor Medvedchuk was arrested in Ukraine on treason charges. And Medvedchuk was not just some random Ukrainian. He was widely regarded as Putin's man in Kiev. He had a long-term, very public friendship and political alliance with Putin. Way back in the Soviet era, he had been involved in the trials of Ukrainian political prisoners. A lot of Ukrainians were jailed as political prisoners during the Soviet era. He was a loud voice for close relations between Ukraine and Russia and was close personally to Putin to the point where Putin was the godfather of Medvedchuk's daughter. Earlier, Medvedchuk had participated in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine over the conflict in eastern Ukraine at Putin's request. So he was seen as kind of an insider to Putin and someone who, in a way, was representing Putin in the Ukrainian elite. Not only was Medvedchuk arrested, but a group of media outlets that he was accused of funding secretly were then closed as well. And if one is looking for a reason why this invasion happened now, the arrest of Medvedchuk may be part of the answer, along with the broader realization that Zelensky was not going to cave in to Putin's demands. Right? If Putin had thought that he was going to get his way with Zelensky, by the time Medvedchuk gets arrested, and it's now the middle of 2021, it's pretty clear that that's not going to happen. Later in the year, at the end of 2021, when the United States began saying that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, Zelensky had two responses. The first one was really to say, well, therefore you need to send us a lot more weapon, you need to give us support, which he's been saying ever since. But the other was to downplay the threat, and that's something he's been criticized for. Why did he downplay the threat of Russian invasion, especially since obviously it turned out to be a correct assessment? This was not Russia's first buildup along Ukraine's borders. Russia had actually done this several times over the previous few years, and it appears that Zelensky was worried that this was a tactic and that Russia was trying to panic Ukrainians as a way of undermining the Ukrainian economy, that this was sort of part of a long-term play, not a short-term plan to invade. And clearly, to the extent that he thought that, he was wrong. But once the invasion began, it seems that his sensibilities as an actor, along with his absolute anger with other Ukrainians that this was taking place, came to the fore. He understood the role that he needed to play, and he understood how to play it. So rather than accepting the offer from the United States to get him out of the country safely, he stayed in Kiev. He's appeared repeatedly on social media, dressed in his what's now become sort of a trademark green olive drab T-shirt, exhorting his citizens to resistance while showing defiance to Russia. And my sense is earning admiration almost universally around the world. Now, to say that he's playing a role does not mean that he's not absolutely sincere. I think he is absolutely sincere, and I think it's important to recognize that. He understands what's asked of him in this particular time, but he's also eager to do it. And in this respect, I think he perfectly embodies the problem that the Russians have run themselves into, which is he's a Ukrainian who 10 years ago spoke mostly Russian, spent a lot of time in Russia, considered Ukraine and Russia to be closely allied countries, but separate countries, and was very happy to get along with the Russians and do business with them. Now, in 2022, he regards Russia as a mortal enemy that is invading his homeland, and he's willing to do anything he can to rally his citizens to fight back, and is quite obviously putting his life at considerable risk. It seems pretty clear that the Russians are aiming for him. They basically said they want to get rid of him. And of course, if they take Kiev and surround Kiev and keep him from getting out, things will not go very pleasantly for him or for his family. But that's the role he's playing now, which is he's going to do what he is urging other Ukrainians to do, which is to fight to the death. And so that's who he has become. He has had greatness thrust upon him, but he's also risen to it. And he's become one of Ukraine's most formidable assets in the information war around the world. And he's also then become, of course, an even bigger thorn in Putin's side than he was before. So we'll see how this goes, but that in a nutshell is who Zelensky is and how he became a hero.